Marcus Elias Webb was 39 years old, and on the night his wife put him out of his own house, he was standing on the curb in a gray t-shirt, with no phone, no wallet, and no keys, watching the rain come down in sheets off the eave of the porch he had built with his own hands 3 summers ago. She had given him 4 minutes. 4 minutes to take what he could grab from the hallway closet, while she stood at the door with her arms folded, and her expression composed in the particular way of someone who has been rehearsing the scene for a very long time. He had come out with a duffel bag that held a change of clothes, a toothbrush, and a framed photograph of his late grandmother that he had grabbed without thinking. The way a man grabs the one thing that actually belongs to him when everything else is being renegotiated. The house was hers, she had told him. The accounts were hers. The car in the driveway was hers. The attorney she had retained 3 months ago, a man named Garrett, who wore cufflinks and billed at $480 an hour, had already prepared the separation agreement that would, she explained, leave Marcus with whatever he had come into the marriage with, which, from where she was standing, was not very much. She had no idea that Marcus Webb had spent 11 years before he met her building something she had never once thought to look for. She had no idea that $2.3 million in documented assets sat in accounts that bore only his name, in a holding company registered in Delaware that his attorney had structured before he ever proposed, because his grandfather had once told him that a man who builds on land he doesn't own is just a tenant. She had no idea what the black SUV that pulled to the curb 2 minutes later meant. She was about to. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The rain had been coming since mid-afternoon, the kind of heavy late September rain that turned the gutters into rivers and made everything smell like wet concrete and old leaves. Marcus had been in his workshop behind the house when the text came. He had read it once, set his phone face down on the workbench, and stood for a moment with both hands flat on the surface, the way he did when he was working out a structural problem, steady, methodical, letting the information settle before he decided what to do with it. The workshop was his. He had built it the year after they moved in, framing it himself on 2 long weekends in October, running the electrical with his cousin Jerome, pouring the concrete pad level to within 1/8 of an inch, because Marcus Webb did not pour uneven concrete. It was where he went when he needed to think. The walls held his grandfather's tools, the hand planes, the chisels, the marking gauges in their wooden rack, and the smell of sawdust and linseed oil that he had known since he was 6 years old, watching Calvin Webb build things in a garage in Richmond, Virginia. His grandfather had told him once, running his thumb along the edge of a freshly sharpened chisel, "The work tells the truth about thee. Man, everything else is just conversation." Marcus had been 12 years old. He had been carrying that sentence like a hand tool ever since, using it when he needed to cut through something that wouldn't yield to other methods. He had met Diane at a conference in Charlotte 8 years ago. She was in marketing, sharp and funny, with a way of walking into rooms that made people notice her, and a way of leaving them that made people remember her. He had been drawn to her directness, to the way she said what she thought without performing it. She had been drawn to him in a way he understood later was more complicated than he had allowed himself to see at the time, drawn to what she perceived as his quietness, his stability, his uncomplicated steadiness, which she had mistaken for simplicity, and he had been content to let be mistaken, because Marcus Webb had never needed anyone to understand the full extent of what he was. They had married 3 years later in a small ceremony in the Shenandoah Valley. Her parents had been politely skeptical. His grandmother Ora had driven up from Lynchburg, taken one look at Diane, said nothing, and squeezed Marcus's hand twice at the reception. He had understood what the 2 squeezes meant. He had chosen not to understand it. The trouble had not arrived all at once. It had come the way structural failure always comes, not in a sudden collapse, but in a series of small compressions, each one individually manageable, accumulating over time until the load-bearing capacity of the whole thing was compromised in ways that a trained eye could have identified years before the break. Marcus had a trained eye. He had looked away. He understood now that looking away had been its own kind of decision. The text that afternoon said, "I need you to come inside. We need to talk." He had put down the plane he was holding. He had walked across the backyard in the rain without an umbrella, because it was his backyard and he had always been the kind of man who did not mind getting wet. That was the last time he walked in from the workshop as a man who lived in that house. He stood on the curb for exactly 2 minutes. He had counted, not out of bitterness, but out of habit. Marcus measured things, always had, the way a carpenter measures before he cuts, because you cannot put the wood back. The rain soaked through the gray t-shirt immediately. The duffel bag sat at his feet. The photograph of his grandmother, still inside the bag, wrapped in the flannel shirt he had grabbed with it. His grandfather's voice, steady in his memory. The work tells the truth about the man. Everything else is just conversation. He looked at the house, the porch he had built, the front steps he had re-leveled 2 springs ago, pulling the old concrete blocks, tamping the base, resetting them true. He had done that on a Saturday morning while Diane slept in, and she had noticed when she came down for coffee and said, "That looks better," and gone back inside, and he had been satisfied by that, had found it sufficient, which told him something now about where they had both been for longer than he wanted to calculate. The black SUV came around the corner at Meridian and slowed without hesitation. He had known it was coming. He had made the call from the workshop before he came inside, when he read the text and understood what it meant and what was about to happen. A single call, 45 seconds, to a number he had known for 11 years. The rear window came down. Jerome Webb, his cousin, his first hire, the man who had helped him run the electrical in the workshop and who now ran day-to-day operations at Webb Structural Group from an office in Raleigh, looked out at him from the back seat with an expression that was several things at once: concerned, ready, and faintly unsurprised. "You need an umbrella," Jerome said. "I need a phone and a dry shirt," Marcus said, in that order. "Both in the bag," Jerome said, and pushed the door open. Marcus picked up the duffel, got in, and pulled the door closed behind him. He did not look back at the house. The next morning, Marcus sat across from his attorney in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building downtown that had been constructed in 1987, and which Marcus, who had renovated 2 floors of it in 2019, knew intimately, knew the load-bearing walls, the rerouted vac, the original terrazzo under the dropped ceilings in the lobby that he had uncovered and restored himself. He knew the building the way he knew most things, from the inside out, structurally, with the kind of knowledge that came from actually doing the work. His attorney was a woman named Phyllis Okafor. She was 56 years old, wore her hair natural and close-cropped, and had been practicing family and business law for 28 years, in a way that suggested she had not once in those 28 years been surprised by anything a spouse had tried to do with marital assets. She had reviewed the separation agreement Garrett had sent over that morning with the particular expression of someone reading a document that was technically competent but strategically naive. "He doesn't know about the Delaware company," she said. It was not a question. She never asked, Marcus said. Phyllis set the agreement down. "She never asked what you did before you met her," she asked. "I told her I did structural consulting," which was true. Phyllis was quiet for a moment. "And the properties?" 4. Richmond, Raleigh. 1 in Philadelphia. The 4th is in Charlotte. He paused. 2 blocks from the restaurant where we had our first date. Phyllis looked at him over her reading glasses with an expression that was as close to amused as she ever got. "That's going to be a moment," she said. "I expect it will be." She went through the agreement line by line, annotating in the margins in a small, precise hand. The terms Garrett had drafted were aggressive. A 60-40 split of marital assets in Diane's favor. Marcus to vacate any claim on the primary residence. No spousal support in either direction. It was the kind of agreement that worked when the party on the short end had limited resources and limited knowledge of what his own position actually looked like. The marital estate, Phyllis said, not looking up, as I understand it, is the house, the joint accounts, and the vehicles. Correct. And the premarital holdings. The company, the 4 properties, the equipment trust. None of it commingled. Not once. Not a dollar. Your grandfather taught you that? He taught me to keep my tools in order, Marcus said. I applied the principle. She finished the annotations and looked up. Garrett is going to have a very bad week, she said. Are you prepared for that? Marcus thought about the porch he had built, the steps he had re-leveled on a Saturday morning, the workshop behind a house that was going to remain exactly where it was, in a marriage that was ending, full of tools that belonged entirely to him. I've been building things my whole life, he said. I know what demolition looks like from the other side. He made one other call that week, from the guest room at Jerome's place in Raleigh, where he had been staying since the Tuesday night. He called his Aunt Celestine in Richmond, his grandmother Aura's younger sister, 81 years old, sharp as the day she was born, who had watched Marcus grow up and had been at the Charlotte wedding and had not said anything to him about Diane that he hadn't been able to say to himself. She listened to the whole account without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Baby, she said, a woman who throws a man out of a house he built in the rain doesn't understand what she's throwing away. She paused. Now she's going to find out. It's not about that, Marcus said. I know it's not, Celestine said. That's exactly why it's going to work out the way it's going to work out. You weren't built for bitterness. Never were. Not a drop of it in you. He sat with that for a while after he hung up, in the quiet of Jerome's guest room with the rain still coming down outside, and the framed photograph of his grandmother on the nightstand where he had placed it first thing when he arrived. Aura Webb, 1938-2019, who had worked as a seamstress and a school cook and had somehow managed to buy 2 houses and send 3 grandchildren to college on wages that should not have permitted it. She had done it with the same patient precision her husband had brought to his woodworking, carefully over time, without announcing it to anyone, because the work was the point, not the announcement. He slept well, which surprised him. He ate breakfast every morning at the kitchen table with Jerome, who said very little and kept the coffee hot, and occasionally looked at Marcus the way people look at someone they are taking the measure of and finding quietly exactly what they expected to find. By Thursday morning, Phyllis had filed the response to Garrett's agreement, along with a 53-page financial disclosure that itemized the premarital holdings in full. She had also, at Marcus's direction, forwarded Garrett a single-page summary document that listed the 4 properties by address, the Delaware Company by registration number, and the Equipment Trust by value. At the bottom of the page, in Phyllis's small, precise hand, was a single line, "Our client will discuss a fair and expedient resolution at your convenience." Garrett called Phyllis within 40 minutes. Diane called Marcus directly that same afternoon, for the first time since Tuesday. He let it go to voicemail. He listened to the message once. Her voice had a quality in it he had not heard before, something stripped of its usual performance. Something that sounded like the plain, unadorned reality of a person who has just seen the actual dimensions of the thing they thought they understood and found them to be very different from what they imagined. She said she thought they should talk. She said perhaps things had been done too quickly. She said she wasn't sure the attorney had given her good advice. He did not return the call. He went back to the workshop. Not his workshop, not yet. Not the one behind the house on Meridian, but the one at the Raleigh yard, the equipment shed behind Webb Structural Group's field office, where they kept the larger hand tools and the staging materials and the architectural salvage he had been collecting for a project he hadn't started yet. He spent 3 hours in there, organizing, cleaning, sharpening what needed sharpening, because that was what he did when a problem had been identified and the solution was in motion and there was nothing left to do but wait for the structure to settle. The work told the truth. Everything else was conversation. The mediation happened on a Monday, 3 weeks later, in a conference room adjacent to Phyllis's office. It was the middle of October by then, clear and cool, the kind of fall day that came in sharp after a long, humid summer and reminded you what air felt like when it had some integrity to it. Marcus wore a jacket he had pressed himself that morning. Garrett arrived first with Diane. She looked at Marcus across the table the way people look at someone they believed they understood completely and have since discovered they understood not at all. It was a particular kind of reckoning, not dramatic, not loud, something much quieter and more total than either of those. A recalibration, the long, slow adjustment of a worldview to accommodate information it had not previously held. Phyllis set down the financial disclosure, the 4 property deeds, the Delaware Company articles, the equipment trust documentation, the 11 years of premarital tax returns, the whole architecture of what Marcus Webb had built before Diane had ever walked into a conference room in Charlotte and noticed him across the room. Our client's premarital holdings are fully documented and entirely separate from the marital estate, Phyllis said, in the even tone of someone describing something that was already decided. We are prepared to negotiate a fair division of the marital assets. We are also prepared to discuss, at our client's discretion, the matter of the porch and deck improvements to the primary residence, which were completed using premarital skills and labor at a documented value of $34,000 and which our client has no legal obligation to forfeit. Garrett looked at the documents. He looked at his client. He looked at the documents again. Diane said, "You owned 4 properties when we got married." "I did," Marcus said. "You never told me. You never asked," he said. "Not unkindly, just accurately. You assumed. That's not the same thing." She looked at him for a long moment. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the 14th floor windows, the city went on with its ordinary business, indifferent to the particular reckoning happening in this particular room. "The Charlotte property," she said slowly. "The address on this sheet." 2 blocks from Garrison's, he said. "Where we had our first date." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, her expression had changed in a way he recognized, the shift that happens when a person stops trying to control the shape of a thing and simply accepts the shape it is. Garrett cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess." "Take all the time you need," Phyllis said pleasantly. Marcus stood. He did not gather his papers. He left them where they were, because they did not need to go anywhere. He walked to the window and looked out at the city, at the buildings, at the construction crane visible 2 blocks east, working on the new medical complex that his company had bid on and won in August. He watched the crane for a moment, the slow, precise articulation of the arm, the counterweight, the cable, the load, and felt something that was not satisfaction exactly, and not relief, and was not victory in any recognizable sense of the word. It was something older than all of those things. It was the feeling of a man who had built what he built, and knew what it was worth, and had never once needed anyone else to tell him so. Garrett and Diane came back from the recess in 11 minutes. The terms they proposed were equitable. Phyllis reviewed them, made 2 amendments, and both parties signed before noon. Marcus walked out of the building into the October air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his jacket open and his hands in his pockets. Jerome was parked half a block up, the black SUV running, waiting exactly where Marcus had asked him to wait. Marcus did not go to the car immediately. He stood for a moment longer, looking at the building across the street, a mid-century structure he had assessed 3 years ago for a potential renovation project that had never come to pass, a building he had walked through alone on a Tuesday morning, noting its bones, its load-bearing structure, the things that were sound, and the things that would need to come down before anything new could go up. He had written the assessment in his field notebook, clipped it, filed it, moved on. Some buildings, he had written then, are worth saving. The bones are good. The problem is always the same. The owners want to renovate around the damage instead of through it. He buttoned his jacket and walked to the car. 14 months passed, like the turning of a season you've prepared for. The house on Meridian sold in December. Diane had moved to a rental in the suburb that Garrett had apparently recommended, which Marcus knew because Celestine had mentioned it in passing during one of their Sunday calls, in which he registered and set aside the way he set aside all information that was not actionable. She had kept her position at the marketing firm. She had, according to mutual acquaintances who told Jerome who did not pass it on unless asked, begun seeing someone. Marcus noted this without feeling much about it in either direction. She was building something new. So was he. The comparison ended there. The Charlotte property, the one 2 blocks from Garrison's, the one she had read off the page with that particular expression, had been renovated over the winter by Marcus and a small crew, 4 months of evenings and weekends. The way he had built the workshop and the porch and everything else he had ever built that mattered. Personally, carefully, board by board. It was now leased to a young family at below market rate because the husband was a carpenter Marcus had hired out of a workforce retraining program 3 years ago, and a man who trained carpenters had an obligation to make sure they had somewhere to live. That was the Webb structural way. It had been Calvin Webb's way, and Ora Webb's way, and it would be Marcus's way, and someday, if he was fortunate, it would be the way of someone he hadn't built with yet. He had moved into the Richmond property, the first one he had ever bought, the one in Church Hill that he had renovated over 2 years in his late 20s before he ever met Diane. The one with the 12-foot ceilings and the original plank floors, and the deep porch that ran the full width of the front. He had unpacked slowly, deliberately, putting things where they belonged. His grandfather's tools went in the basement workshop. The photograph of his grandmother went on the mantel in the front room, in the afternoon light, where it had always looked like it belonged. He had met a woman named Adrienne at a structural assessment in February. She was the project architect, and she asked better questions than most engineers he had worked with. And she had a way of reading a space that reminded him of the way his grandmother had read people, quietly and without announcing it. They had dinner twice, and then a third time, and then, without either of them making a declaration about it, they were simply present in each other's lives, in the way that real things are present. Not announced, just there. She had looked at the front porch on a Sunday morning in April, with her coffee in both hands, and said, "This is excellent work," in the way architects say it, meaning structurally. He had said, "I know," in the way builders say it, meaning the same thing. Jerome called him on a Thursday in early fall to tell him that Garrett, Diane's attorney, had been named in a bar complaint by a separate client. The complaint was unrelated to Marcus. Jerome had heard it through a mutual contact and passed it on because he believed information was neutral and Marcus could decide what to do with it. Marcus said, "Thank you," and went back to the drawing he had been working on. He did not gloat. He did not think about it again for more than a moment. Bitterness required ongoing emotional investment in people who no longer deserved it, and Marcus Webb had never had interest in investments that didn't build anything. On a Saturday morning in October, 1 year and 2 weeks after the night he stood on the curb in the rain, Marcus was in the workshop in Church Hill, sharpening a hand plane on the whetstone, the long, steady strokes that required attention and patience, and produced, when done correctly, an edge that could take a whisper off a piece of hard maple. The light came in through the east window, flat and early, the color of the season. The smell was linseed oil and shaved wood, and the cold that had been settling into the mornings lately in the way it did every year at this time, arriving quietly, taking up residence without asking. He worked without hurrying. He had built everything worth keeping. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.